This episode of PharmacyToDose, the Critical Care Podcast, is proudly sponsored by Chiesi. Chiesi is a family-owned, research-focused, sustainable pharmaceutical company accredited with both B Corp and a benefit corporation status. Chiesi is making global changes that benefits patients, providers, and healthcare organizations with forward-looking and impactful initiatives. Chiesi appreciates the integral role that clinical pharmacists play in patient care and are proud to support this community. To learn more, visit chiesi.pharmacytodose.com. Again, that's chiesi.pharmacytodose.com. The Critical Care PRN is dedicated to fostering the role of critical care pharmacists as essential members of the multidisciplinary patient care team. The Critical Care PRN's goal is to optimize drug therapy outcomes by promoting excellence and innovation in clinical pharmacy practice, research, and education. For more information, including how to become a member, go to critprn.accp.com. Again, that website is critprn.accp.com. Welcome to PharmacyToDose, the Critical Care Podcast, a partner of the ACCP Critical Care PRN. And I'm your host, Nick Peters. And wherever you are and however you are listening, thank you. Happy March Madness, one and all. The time has arrived. It is here, the 2024 Critical Care Trials March Madness bracket, letting you, the listener, ultimately decide what is the most influential, important, and best trial in critical care. So there are two preview episodes, and this episode will preview the bleeding, blood glucose, and Neuro PADIS regions. And the other episode will review sepsis fluids and the cardiac pulmonary regions. So our bracketologists today are Jason Hecht from the bleeding blood glucose region and Corinne Berger from the Neuro PADIS region. A few housekeeping things to review before we get into the preview. Have to thank the committee members for all their help with voting on which trials to include and assisting in the ranking process. Absolutely couldn't have made this happen without all of them. You'll hear in the episode we joke about the committee, but all jokes aside, everyone was unbelievable in giving some of their thoughts on which trials to include, how to rank them. So really, really appreciate it. Need to shout them out in the beginning. So for the Neuro PADIS region, that includes Aaron Cook, Caitlin Brown, Leslie Hamilton, and Joanna Stallings. And for the bleeding blood glucose region, big thanks to Melanie Smith-Condeni, Scott Dietrich, Brian Gilbert, Allie Lewis, Megan Reck, and the combo team of Brandon Hobbs and Aaron Afoe for their time and effort as committee members. Now, each bracketologist had one rule they had to follow, and I followed this rule as well. They were mandated to have one upset, meaning a 9 seed or lower making it to the Sweet 16. So each bracketologist has at least a 9 seed or lower going into the Sweet 16. I do as well. I filled out a whole bracket, so you'll get to hear some of my picks along with the bracketologists. Now remember, the bracketologists are just predicting what they think will happen. But if you go to @PharmacyToDose on Twitter, X, or Instagram, you can vote to determine who actually advances. Let's talk about some key dates from a voting perspective. Today, if you're listening to this, the day came out. It is Monday, March 18th. So the 18th and the 19th, play-in game voting. Each region's going to have one play-in game, so 4 games to vote on. And as we move forward, each round, there'll be 3 days of voting. So Wednesday the 20th through Friday the 22nd, that's the first round. Second round is Saturday the 23rd through Monday the 25th. Tuesday's an off day for us, right? We're going to regroup just like how the tournament, it's weekends. We get a day off in between, and then the Sweet 16 voting, the third round, starts on Wednesday the 27th, ends Friday the 29th. The fourth round of the Elite Eight, that's Saturday the 30th through April 1st, Monday. And then our Final Four voting takes place Wednesday, April 3rd through Friday, April 5th. With the championship game voting being Saturday, April 6th through Monday, April 8th, ending on the same day as the national championship game. Last thing, made some shirts for the bracketologists as a thank you for their effort. We're having a little bit of a contest. Everyone filled out a bracket, and the 2 most accurate are going to get 2 t-shirts. So the bracketologists, they had to come on. They had to help me record the episode. Friends of the pod, do you want a shirt? All you need to do, fill out a bracket, take a picture of your bracket that's filled out, tag me in it at PharmacyToDose on social media. Once you do that, you're entered. I'm going to take 3 winners out of a hat. We're going to randomly choose, and they'll get a Bracketologist shirt. So, got to tag me in it by the time the first round voting has started. So I got to have it by Wednesday, March 20th. And if you're wondering, brackets are available at PharmacyToDose.com or links on the social media pages at PharmacyToDose. One other note, very sorry, you're going to hear random chords throughout the episode. Didn't realize while we're recording, I have a microphone on like a microphone arm. Didn't realize that it wasn't secured. It was kind of moving around. It was making some random noises, random chord noises. Hopefully not too annoying. Obviously didn't realize what was happening. Big apologies on my end, friends. But now it is time for the preview of the bleeding blood glucose and Neuro PADIS regions in the 2024 Critical Care Trials March Madness bracket. And it is time, the 2024 Critical Care Trials March Madness bracket. And today's episode, we are previewing the West and North regions, aka bleeding and blood glucose and Neuro PADIS. And what better time for us to introduce our incredible bracketologists. And reviewing the Neuro PADIS region, we have Corinne Berger. Now, Corinne is a critical care pharmacist and assistant professor of pharmacy practice at Nova Southeastern University. You can hear from the fight song, a proud Florida Gators basketball fan. You can find her on Twitter or X at Corinne CCRX. And discussing the bleeding blood glucose region, we are joined by Jason Hecht. Now, Jason is a surgical critical care clinical pharmacy specialist and critical care PGY2 RPD at Trinity Health in Ann Arbor. And you can hear from this incredible fight song behind us that Jason supports the greatest team in the college basketball land, the Butler Bulldogs, who play at historic Hinkle Fieldhouse. Now, welcome, Jason, Corinne. Now, the order of discussion today was determined via rock, paper, scissors, best of 3 on shoot. So I don't even actually know. So who was the winner? Who decided the order of today?
So the winner was not picked by home field advantage with the Butler connection, but I was the winner of the rock, paper, scissors with an epic comeback. So I will be going first today.
You could say home court advantage because Corinne definitely thought it was best of 1, and she won the first one. So when it was best of 3, she got a little rattled, I think. So she probably would disagree about the home field advantage thing.
That's okay. I was going to pick to go second, so I feel like a winner still.
This is like the Super Bowl. Okay, we're back. So reminder for everybody, right? The bracketologists are predicting the bracket and who will win these matchups. But you, the listener, you have the ultimate say. So at PharmacyToDose on X or Twitter and Instagram to vote on who you think deserves to advance in the 2024 Critical Care Trials March Madness bracket. So we'll have links to download the brackets on social media. You can do that right now, or the website PharmacyToDose.com. Okay. So we're getting into the East region, bleeding or blood glucose. And this actually features our lowest ranked number 1 seed. So let's kind of reveal the bracket a little bit, talk about some of these matchups, and get into the nitty gritty. So the lowest ranked 1 seed, the Crash 2 trial, and they are going up against the rough and tumbly, the diaper dandy 16 seed, the Crash 3 trial. So in the next matchup, the battle of 8 versus 9, it's the thrombolytic battle with the 8 seed Patho versus the 9 seed Moppet Study. Now in the classic 5-12 matchup, our 5 seed is the GI bleed risk factors, but our 12 seed is a play-in game for this region. And our play-in game is the 12 seed. It's the Trix 3 trial versus the Peptic trial. Now, the 4 seed, you could argue a juggernaut, is the low molecular weight heparin for VTE prophylaxis in trauma study versus ranked 13 in at-large bid, the Annexa 4 trial. So the 6 seed is none other than our transfusion medicine study proper versus the start of the blood glucose trend, Leuven 1, the 11 seed. Now the 3 seed is the trick trial, looking at our transfusion goals versus the upper GI bleeding transfusion goals trial. Now the favorite 7-10 upset matchup, right? The number 7 is the patch study, and that's the patch study looking at platelets in ICH versus Pro-Coag, the 2023 JAMA study looking at PCC. And closing out our East region, the bleeding and blood glucose bracket, is the 2 seed Nice Sugar, the juggernaut, facing kind of like its son, like a father-son matchup here, the 15 seed TGC Fast. All right, Jason, before we get in the matchup, of course, we gotta talk about the bracket itself. So we went through everything. Let's start with snubs. Did anybody stand out as is something undeserving here? Would you have replaced it? What are your thoughts on who got included?
Well, first of all, I'm not even going to try to leave my bias at the door. Working in a surgical ICU, bleeding, blood loss, that's my passion. That's my bread and butter. All of these glucose trials, just not going to get me excited, not going to get me going. I think we're going to be going hard after the bleeding and coag section of this bracket. Talking about snubs, I was surprised with a few of the glucose trials that ended up in here, Leuven 1 specifically. I mean, we're not even talking about a study right now where we're incorporating this into our practice. I can't believe it ended up with some of these other giants that we're talking about here. I'm thinking that was one that probably should have left at home and dropped down into the NIT. I don't think it belongs in the big bracket up here with some of these other juggernauts. In terms of things we were missing, a few that come to mind, tenecteplase for ischemic stroke. I was really surprised to not have any representation there, especially since it's such a hot topic and rolling out all around the country right now.
Now we'll get to that. That would be in the neuro bracket. So the one thing for the listeners as we're going through it, we tried to divvy it up as best I could. There may have been some gripes on some specific trials. So I do have beef with a tenecteplase study that was not involved, not related to stroke. Why was the Troika study not included? But we have the Moppet trial. I got beef with that, right? The Troika, we're looking at empiric thrombolytics, looking at tenecteplase, right? The agent that we're all using now. And instead, we have the Moppet trial when we have the Patho that's just high quality, better, and it's tenecteplase, right? That's my biggest beef. You mentioned tenecteplase. We'll get to the ischemic stroke when we get Corinne on talking about neuro, but that was mine. The other one, where's reverse AD?
Yeah.
No dabigatran reversal. All right. So what anything else stand out from your perspective?
Other big one near and dear to my heart working in trauma was timing of VTE prophylaxis in any patient with a TBI, traumatic intracranial hemorrhage. Can't believe we're not talking about the timing of VTE prophylaxis and the impact we're making in trauma patients now as compared to 10, 20 years ago. I think that's an absolute snub and belonged in the bracket, especially over some of those thrombolysis studies we were going to dive into about PE, how those ended up as 8, 9 seeds smack in the middle of the bracket with some of these other left off. It's not making any sense to me, Nick.
I know. What's the committee doing? They're not looking at their out of conference schedule here. They don't have enough quad 1 wins, in my opinion, to get that 8 or 9 seed. I agree. Let's talk a little bit about.
This isn't a problem unique to college basketball, though. We've creeped over into critical care studies too. But...
It's a virus. It's just spreading. So this is the region with the lowest amount of unanimous votes. And unanimous votes means every one of the committee members voted to include this study. And the only two unanimous were Crash 2 and Nice Sugar. So a little more controversy or variety in voting than other regions. Some trials that won tiebreaker or at-large bids. So what does that even mean, right? Tiebreaker, if there was a voting process and there were ties in terms of, number of spots versus trials picked. First, the first tiebreaker was I removed myself from the voting. It's like, let's just see what the results look like if I take myself out. And that typically solved the most of them. So that was a tiebreaker. And an at-large bid is just a trial that I missed. All right, so the way the process was is I sent all these trials out, and people looked at them, gave me a review on if they would have included something different or not. Did people vote on it? So that's how that happened. So 4 trials that won tiebreaker at-large bids. Upper GI bleed transfusion goals, Trix 3, Moppet, which we were talking about, and TGC Fast. Couple of things into the region breakdown before we get into the rankings and into our matchups here. So bleeding blood glucose, what does that mean, right? So we have 5 trauma-related studies, 3 glucose-related studies, 3 transfusion goal-related studies, meaning when you would transfuse somebody or not based on a specific number. GI prophylaxis-related studies, 2 of them, 2 thrombolytic studies, and 2 kind of more general coagulation studies. Biggest variety of journals. So we got 5 different journals represented. New England Journal, of course, leading with 9, 3 JAMA, 3 Lancet, and a shout out to Circulation and the American Journal of Cardiology, each getting some love in the bleeding blood glucose region. When we look at time frame, right, pretty even. Pre-2000s, we got 3 studies. In the 2000s, 2. Big 2010 year for this one. 8 studies here. And in the 2020s, we got 4 of them. Oldest study included the 1994 New England Journal of Medicine Deborah Cook study, GI bleed risk factors. The mean 2012 year with most publications, 2023. So it's actually kind of new kid on the block, variety. So anything stand out as over or under ranked to you when you look? Anything you want to give the committee feedback on, Jason, about the ranking?
First of all, I think this is going to be a really polarizing bracket. This one's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out with the listeners, because we have a very diverse group of studies as well as interest and practice areas included here. Bleeding and glucose in a lot of ways couldn't be more on the opposite end of the spectrum. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how those interests play out and fan out over the course of this bracket. To me, the one that jumps out as overrated potentially is going to be Crash 2. And obviously this one has a ton of name recognition. Everyone is going to know Crash 2 immediately after hearing it. But the results are going to be pretty niche to a trauma patient population. It's not going to be something generalizable to all areas of critical care. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out ultimately with the voters here. Are we going to be favoring studies that are generalizable and can be applicable to all avenues of critical care? Or are we purely going on how impressive and how dramatic the results of a study are? And I think Crash 2 for me could be one that ends up being very polarizing. Has all the name recognition, has a ton of patients recruited from all over the world. But with how niche it is, I don't know how well that's going to play out with the listeners overall. And I think that could be one that doesn't make it as far as we might think it would. Going back to teams that may have been undeserving or maybe aren't slotted low enough. I think we touched on a little bit, but the thrombolysis in PE, I think that is one for sure that's too heavily weighted, being that 8-9 matchup. Again, this is a relatively niche patient population, only looking at moderate PEs for both studies. Moppet in particular, single center, just barely over 100 patients. Probably not even standard of care anymore at a lot of large centers if they have interventional radiology. I'm thinking that's one that's given far too much love by the committee and really should have ended up lower, if not in the play-in game or the NIT. I'm just not seeing it as a 9 seed, Nick.
Yeah, we're on the same page with the 9 seed there. I completely agree. Now, the funny thing is, I have Leuven 1 as underrated, and you have them as undeserving. So I just think that's, when you think of influence and importance, Leuven 1, Crash 2, I don't think you can dismiss that we're literally still researching less Leuven-1, but man, we're still researching TXA and trauma. Maybe people are annoyed by that, right? Like I have Crash 2 as the Duke of the region. It's important. Everyone knows about it, but we probably don't really like it all that much. So that you'll hear that in each of the region. Each region will have its Duke. It just happens to be the 1 seed of the Crash 2 trial here.
I had to pick my Duke of this region. I think I'm going with Trick. I think if we're talking transfusion requirements, this is one that we know the results, we know what's good for our patients, but we just do not want to follow it. Waiting for somebody to drop below 7 in practice just is a killer, and the desire to want to transfuse higher than that and try to skirt the rules despite the data being clear. To me, Trick is the Duke of the bracket. It's going to be a powerhouse of a study. Certainly was a landmark trial, but man, do we not want to follow it and not want to like it.
So let's get into our matchups. So for the listeners to know, as we're going through this, didn't have many rules for the bracketologist, but one rule I did have was they had to have an underdog. They had to have a 9 seed or lower go to the Sweet 16. When you listen to this, just keep that in mind. Do you, the listener, have to do that? Absolutely not. The bracketologist did. So remember that. All right. Play in game. And for the record, I refuse to refer to this as the first round. If you do, you're wrong. I'm just putting that out there. This is the play-in game. First round is when we get to the round of 64. All right, play-in game, 12 seed here, which you'd argue these are typically the biggest bubble teams, teams that were on the biggest verge of not making it. So who do you have winning in the battle of Tricks 3, the 2017 New England Journal of Medicine study versus the 2020 JAMA study, Peptic?
I think this is a no-brainer to me. I think Peptic is taking this one, and Peptic to me is actually my Cinderella for the whole bracket. How they ended up having to play an extra game to land their seat at the big boy table makes no sense to me. I mean, we're talking 27,000 patients essentially showing the non-inferiority of H2 antagonists to PPIs. And this was a groundbreaking study, still influencing practice, has a ton of name recognition. I think Peptic's going to swing far above its weight class as a playing game participant here. Not only is going to dominate the play-in bracket, but I think it's one that could make some noise in the whole tournament.
Well, that's why you're the bracketologist. We'll agree to disagree. My bracket does not have that, but I do have Peptic winning the play-in game. I also like that these findings are just controversial enough, right? There wasn't definitive. There's enough that, like, if you actually are pro PPI, you can argue enough. Yep. And if you're pro H2, you can also, it's one of those studies you could kind of, it supports whatever view you have, which I enjoy. So in something like this, thinking of influence, right, that makes a whole lot of sense.
Yep.
All right. As we look at our first round region, what are, highlight for the listeners, a few of the matchups that instantly stand out that we want to kind of highlight, dig a little bit deeper into?
I think the first one that jumps out at me purely because I think this is going to give us a lot of insight into how the bracket's going to play out is going to be Leuven-1 versus Proper. To me, this was the first round matchup that pits the blood glucose versus bleeding against each other right out of the gate. And I think this is going to be a good barometer to feel out how the rest of this bracket's going to play out. I could not be more curious to see where our listeners and where our voters are ultimately going to land on the decisive issue between the two major categories of papers. And I think this one is going to give us the insight that we need. They're dramatically different studies being the only crossover between bleeding and glucose. I think this is going to tell us the will of the people here.
It almost feels like Proper is like a Big 12 team. No defense. We're running, gunning, right? You're in the resuscitation because it's comparing the 1-1-1 versus 1-1-1-2 in the products. I think I said that wrong. You know what I mean? Versus Leuven-1, right? Which resuscitation is more fun than managing blood glucose. Let me be clear. Not more important, more fun. I completely agree. If Leuven-1 wins, I think this could be a glucose bracket. And if we have Proper kind of dominating, it feels like the coagulation transfusion can come in. You know, Leuven-1, I feel like, is the old school. They're going to slap their hands on the floor, try to slow the game down. So it'll be a battle of wills. Very, very curious. Had that marked as well. Who do you have winning it?
To me, I'm going Proper. Again, I'm not even going to pretend to hide my bias here. proper is something I'm incorporating every day into my practice. One-to-one transfusion has been a game changer for us. It's our gospel, it's our Bible, and the importance of that study to me and my patient population, that one's taken it by far. I view Leuven 1 as like a Bob Knight, old school IU basketball team wearing short shorts, playing hard defense, throwing chairs out onto the court. But I think proper with their more modern spin on medicine and the innovation to transform how we transfuse trauma patients. I think proper is the clear winner here and deserves a spot. Moving on.
Yep, absolutely. All right. Awesome first matchup. Completely agree. That stood out instantly. All right. As you walk through, what are some other matchups?
I think the other one that really jumps out at me is the GI bleed risk study and peptic from the playing game. To me, I see this as two excellent studies, both of them groundbreaking in their own way. The GI bleed risk study is still something we incorporate into our practice every day with withholding stressors for prophylaxis, unless we're doing a prolonged course of mechanical ventilation. Still something we teach all of our students, still something every intern gets indoctrinated into on ICU rounds the first time they do it. Still something extremely relevant to this day. I worry it doesn't have the sexy name recognition like some of the other studies in this bracket do. We don't have a cool acronym.
There's no acronym. That's tough.
Any brand recognition here. The content is solid. It's there. That is a groundbreaking study. I just don't know if it's going to have the name recognition to carry it through. Heptic, on the other hand, I mean, now we're talking a name recognition. This is something that's going to jump out at people. It's going to be readily apparent what the study is about. And I think this is going to be a really interesting one to play out in the first round here, assuming peptic makes it through the playing game.
And it's pharmacotherapy, right? And it's comparing drugs, right? As a lot of pharmacists filling this out. So from what you're saying, I feel like you're leaning peptic in a super close one. This is almost the best matchup.
I'm absolutely leaning peptic. To me, that's a Sweet 16 team. They're going to get the extra game in the playing game as a little bit of a warm up. They're going to be ready to go for their run to the Sweet 16.
Man, I feel sentimental for the Deborah Cook study. I'm not sure there's been a study that I've emailed more out when I was like the classic day shift. It's just one that like people know the GI stuff. They don't know where this study comes from. You get to shout out Deborah Cook, who's the best, the Canadian critical care trials leader. There's a world where the winner of this wins the whole bracket. There really is. Like, I almost feel like Peptic is the team, like their star player got hurt and he came back for the conference tournament. So they're underseeded for sure. This feels really close. You're saying Peptic. My heart leads GI bleed risk factors. I'm going to go with my heart for sure.
I'm with you though. I could see either one of these making a long run in the tournament. I think it's all going to depend on what kind of brand recognition we can get with the GI bleed risk study. This is one that could easily go either way and could make some noise in this tournament.
As we look out, the rest of the region, Crash 2, Crash 3, is this the trial version of Godfather 2 versus Godfather 3? Am I overthinking it, or is it truly that easy? Like Crash 2 is going to go like 90% of the vote?
No, I think this is an absolute no-brainer. To me, I'm a huge fan of the 1-2 seed upset. I love watching a good blue blood go down in a tournament, but I'm just not seeing it this year in this corner of the bracket. I think our 1 and 2 seeds here are going to be pretty bulletproof. The name recognition is too strong, and there's no worthy competitor for each of them. Crash 2 is going to beat up on their little cousin here. Crash 3, I don't even think that one will be close. Nice sugar down at the bottom of the bracket there is looking pretty bulletproof as a 2 seed. I think both of those are primed for a nice, easy run through the tournament to the Sweet 16.
Yeah, the other one's the 8-9 matchup. Also feels like the 3-14 and Patho versus Moppet, right? Like Patho double-blind, placebo-controlled RCT. Moppet, despite having an incredible name, don't doubt that, right? 10% of the patients. You don't need to go into it. Feels like Patho by a mile.
This feels like the 8-9 seed game that they play out on the West Coast somewhere and broadcast it at 11 p.m. at night Eastern time because they know nobody really wants to watch it, even though they're two respectable teams.
Even though they know I'll be watching it and a few others, definitely. Now, I'll tell you what, I would say the matchup that stood out to me was the 4 versus 13. just low molecular weight heparin in trauma VT prophylaxis versus Nexa-4. It feels like, one of the least controversial and widely adopted studies, the low molecular weight heparin, versus the Nexa-4, you'd argue one of the most controversial studies and most polarizing studies in what they found. Yeah. I don't think Nexa-4 is the definitive study. We can all agree on that. Feels like Nexa-I will be closer. Low molecular weight heparin, been in practice for almost 30 years. Amazing from this study, right? 30 milligrams sub-Q, Q12. So I feel like low molecular weight heparin wins, but it feels like it's a tie game with 5 minutes left, and they just pull away their experience. It's 1996, New England Journal of Medicine say they kind of pull away. But it feels closer than we may have thought, for sure.
Really curious how a Nexa is going to play out with our audience here. I think this is going to be an extremely polarizing competitor, and it really could go either way.
Yep.
Obviously, this is going to be one fresh on everyone's mind. We're going to have a ton of brand awareness with a Nexa-4. Everyone knows about it. Bleeding with DOACs and how to handle it has been a big deal for a long time now. And this coming out as the first FDA-approved agent to be able to address it, and really the study that got them on the map, albeit a very flawed study, which is where I think a lot of the controversy could come into play. How applicable was it to clinical practice? Was looking at non-clinical endpoints for the sake of FDA approval really going to play with the audience? And to me, like you said, not being the definitive study, and still all these years later having to follow up to compete against their off-label competitor for market share. I'm thinking this is going to be one that's going to be polarizing and either could make a ton of noise purely because of brand recognition and novelty of the study and of the agent in particular, or it could be one that falls flat on its face.
Yeah, if you're a 13 seed, you can't have that many questions about your play, about your lineup, all the things, right? You gotta have it more tightened up. So I feel like it's close. I agree. 4 seed. Now,
I feel like this is the mid-major coming out that could go on a heater, could get hot at the right time, even though they have some very glaring holes in the lineup.
314. Trick versus upper GI bleed transfusion. Literally, the 14 seed study doesn't exist without Trick. Literally set the stage. I don't think we even need to spend much more time than that. Trick by probably 100% more than likely.
Absolute no-brainer.
Now the one left in the bracket I want to talk about, the 7 seed patch trial versus the 10 seed the ProCoag PCC study. Both looking at empiric treatment. Both did not show benefit. So which one, when you were talking through, who do you think ultimately comes out? Because this is a close one too. Barn burner.
It's going to be a really close one. And again, we're diving into a really niche area with both of these studies. I think it's going to be really interesting to pair them head to head and see how that matchup plays out. But I don't see a whole lot of noise being made by either competitor in the long run in this tournament. Purely looking at the matchup, to me, I think Patch was the clear winner here in the 7-10. Although a negative result, like you said, I think the seed of doubt planted in everyone's mind about saving those precious platelet resources that we have. I think to me, that's going to be far more important than the relatively negative result too that we saw with PCCs and trauma. Not something that's been widely adopted, hasn't made a lot of noise, wasn't really the big splash it could have been. And I think Patch with brand recognition and still making some noise despite the relatively negative result. I think Patch is going to be the clear winner here.
What you just said is why I think ProCoag wins. Because if this study is even remotely questionably positive, had any sort of benefit, everyone would be pushing to use it. The fact that this was a high quality study researching and preventing an intervention that most pharmacists would be involved with or typically involved with the helping of, I actually I stay in my lane a lot of times. You're not going to hear me recommending platelets most of the time, right? But you'll hear me talk about PCC a bunch. That's why I think it's ProCoag. I think it's close though. I could see the argument. My argument feels like we're down 2 and we get a buzzer beater for the win for ProCoag in a crazy 7-10 game. But man, is it close in the desert out there for sure. All right. Great first round in the bleeding blood glucose matchup here. Now, let's kind of get into our round of 32, our second round. And we have We got 8 teams here, 4 matchups. So which two, when you look at the bracket, instantly draw your eyes, are things you want to talk to the listeners about?
I think when I'm looking at the second round, the big one that jumps out at me is going to be proper versus trick. I think this could be another polarizing one in a lot of ways. Trick's obviously going to be much more generalizable to nearly every ICU patient population, and I do think that is going to be worth quite a bit in a tournament like this. Doesn't matter whether you're working in a medical ICU, a neuro ICU, cardiac ICU, you're dealing with transfusions and transfusion requirements, and I think generalizability is probably going to bring trick over the top, but purely in terms of novelty and how impressive a study was to conduct, I think proper is very much so a juggernaut in its own right. And in terms of impact that it's had on the patient population that the study is serving, I think proper may be swinging above its weight class in that regard. I just worry generalizability and how niche of a patient population we're talking with proper could limit it, but that's a second round matchup I'm really excited to see play out. Our listeners and viewers and ultimately voters going to prioritize generalizability to all aspects of critical care, or are we purely looking at the impact and quality of study design and difficulty to conduct? And in my mind, I think proper would be the winner in that scenario. But overall, I think generalizability is going to win out. I think we're going to have a little more fans in the corner for Trick. But overall, absolute juggernauts here with Trick pulling it out in overtime.
We're back in Florida Butler here. Trick versus proper feels like ICU versus the ED, right? The classic Big East versus SEC, just a haymaker. To me, setting the number of when to transfuse of 7, right? We also fell in we don't have another number to memorize. I think that's good, right? And you think about it, you got Rivers early goal-directed therapy, right? That was hematocrit less than 30. So we were doing tons of transfusions more than 7. I don't know. To me, unless we have a large ED response, it feels like proper's good, trick's better, right? But they tried a good run, but maybe not necessarily in the end, they didn't necessarily pull it off.
Yeah. I think the other second round matchup that jumps out as interesting to me, not because I actually think it's going to be competitive in the slightest. I think Crash 2 Petho is going to be interesting because I want to see what kind of traction Crash 2 is actually going to garner in a tournament like this. I think that's one that could either end up making it all the way to the Final Four or could fall flat on its face in the early rounds, depending on how the listeners want to look at this one. I'm really curious for that second round matchup just to see what kind of traction Crash 2 is actually going to get with the audience and ultimately using that as a barometer for what kind of noise they can make in the rest of the tournament.
Yeah, I think the HC Petho, it just crashed into a bad matchup, right? Looking at Tenecta place in PE versus Crash 2. The thing that I'm going to hold against the Petho trial the most, right, those patients were all normotensive, and they essentially looked at thrombolytics prevent decompensation. How are we using them now, right? We're doing it when they are decompensated. So I think it's, I actually think that I think this is going to be a bigger blowout than maybe you, the expert, thinks, because I just think that when you look at influence, we still don't know what to do with thrombolytics and PE. Like how much? Now the thing is, the argument is people would say we still don't know what to do with TXA and trauma, so I can't argue that either. For the other side of it, thinking about those trials, but feels like Crash 2. I agree. The one seed. So we're on chalk so far, 1 and 3. Who's your upset?
I think to me the upset here is going to be Peptic still coming from the playing game. Now, don't get me wrong. I think if I were personally picking and it were up to me, I think the GI bleed risk study is overall the far better one in that first round and should be the winner coming out. I just don't see it playing that way with the audience. I think I see Peptic taking it purely because of name recognition, and I think not having the acronym is really going to hurt him here. To me, this is the equivalent of Butler having the cute bulldog running on the court and all the fans that come along with it, just because you have this cute thing to latch yourself onto. And I think the GI bleed risk study not having that that signature mascot, that signature name, a sexy title, I think it could end up hurting it, which is where Peptic is going to start its run. And I think Peptic absolutely has a chance to take down the low molecular weight in trauma in the second round there and make their way to the Sweet 16.
That's our first big upset. That would be crazy. It could definitely happen, right? Peptic's they essentially got the home court advantage, but they're going against. I mean, we're comparing treatments, right, in prophylaxis. Recency bias wins in a lot of things, so I could see you saying that. Man, that would hurt my heart if that won. I'm not gonna lie to you.
I think we take for granted that low molecular weight heparin is just what we use in trauma. I'm almost wondering anymore if the controversy is not even there because it's so well established. It's all we've been doing for so long. Nearly every listener on the podcast, that's all they're going to have known from training on. I'm thinking the impact of that one is going to be lost, and Peptic has a chance to come through with the upset. And in fact, I think they will.
All right. That's the upset into the Sweet 16 as mandated. And then Nice Sugar versus Patch. I think we can quickly go over it. What a bad matchup for mandated. What a bad matchup for Patch. They had a good run. It was great, but they encountered a team that runs a completely different scheme. Nice Sugar presses all along the floor. Talked about still being researched, right? See that first matchup. So I think it's Nice Sugar again in a landslide. Nice Sugar's had a really easy first and second round. So your Sweet 16, your 4 Sweet 16 teams, you have Crash 2, Peptic, Trick, and Nice Sugar, correct?
Correct.
So just for the listeners keeping track at home, my bracket is I got Crash 2, low molecular weight heparin for VT prophylaxis, Trick, and I actually have Pro-Coag as my update, just as my upset pick, right? Transfusing is more fun than managing blood glucose, and we're going to leave it at that. All right.
More fun, but you've lost your mind.
All right, let's get into our third round, the Sweet 16, right? So we're moving weekends here, and at this point, these are two great trials here. So which one of these is your favorite out of the two?
I'm not sure either one of these is going to get me out of bed. I think both of these are going to be landslides. This is going to be as chalk as it gets, unfortunately, in the Sweet 16. I think Crash 2 and Nice Sugar are on a collision course here in the Elite 8 for a chance to make it to the Final Four and come out of the bracket. I don't see any way that those two juggernauts don't advance from the 1 and 2 spots.
Peptics, they made it. They made it past the weekend. They were on all the sports shows. They were like George Mason and St. Peter's. They had their run. Now you're playing the heavyweight. Now you're playing a team that looked at film on you, and it's tough. Sure. They found the holes in the Peptic trial, and they ran you into the ground. So I completely agree. Crash 2 by a landslide here. Now, let's get into Nice Sugar versus Trick. We're going to agree to disagree here. I feel like
this is going to be a much better matchup than what we saw on the other end of the bracket. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Trick is definitely capable of swinging in the same weight class as Nice Sugar here.
Yeah, it's a battle of wills.
What's one study that every pharmacy student you've ever had on rotation with you is going to hear about at some point? I'd be willing to bet not a single preceptor has gone by without talking about the Nice Sugar trial when dealing with an ICU rotation. And I think the generalizability and overall impact and importance and really solidifying for good how we should be managing glucose specifically in critical care patients. I think Nice Sugar is going to run away with it, but this is going to be one hell of a matchup because Trick has a quite impressive resume coming into the tournament as well.
Yeah, who wants it more, right? They both have their web spread everywhere. To me, I'm looking at tournament experience. And the fact that Trick was in 1999, Nice Sugar was late 2000s, maybe early 2010s. I think that matters. Trick's got that tournament experience. It stood the test of time, right? So I think it's close. It's definitely going to come down to whoever has the ball last is what I think. We're going to see who's able to defend. All right. What the listeners have been waiting on. I completely agree. I think these teams, Crash 2, the 1 seed, versus Nice Sugar, the 2 seed. These teams have been on a collision course for the Elite 8 ever since the bracket was released. And the irony is, the Nice Sugar is the number 1 2 seed. Crash 2 is the number 4 1 seed. So these two have been going at it even since the voting process. All right. talk to listeners through this matchup and who you think ultimately is your Final Four team for the East region, the bleeding and blood glucose bracket region.
So now to me, we have Crash 2 and Nice Sugar going head to head here for a chance to go to the Final Four. And I think Crash is gonna run into an opponent here that they just don't have a chance to beat. I think Trick in the Elite Eight is gonna put up a better fight than what we're gonna see Crash 2 put up against Nice Sugar. I think Nice Sugar is gonna be the clear winner of this bracket, cement their spot in the Final Four. Again, name recognition, just pure quality of study and the impact that it's had on clinical care. I think Crash 2 is a little too niche, still leaves some questions unanswered, not going to be generalizable to the entire ICU population that is going to be encountered by the listeners. I think Trick is going to put up a better fight against Nice Sugar than Crash 2 is going to be able to, and I think Nice Sugar is going to have a nice, easy game coasting into the Final Four.
I think it matters too. Crash 2 had an incredibly easy route to the final game. I mean, they blew through their bracket, right? I mean, they beat Crash 2, Patho, and Peptic. Meanwhile, Trick had to beat the Patch Trial and Proper. Those are juggernauts. So I could see, I kind of see what you're saying. Tournament tested, battle tested. And again, I think we'll see early in the region what play and voting is like. I think that'll make it very clear which one of these is going to come out, because we kind of got two buckets, right? Bleeding blood glucose, and you'd argue two of the most influential studies in both of those categories made it to that Elite Eight final game. All right, so your winner, recapping for the listeners, right? You had your Elite Eight teams, the final matchup as Nice Sugar versus Crash 2, with ultimately Nice Sugar advancing. For the listeners keeping track at home, I had Crash 2 versus Trick, with Trick ultimately winning as my bleeding blood glucose pick. All right, Corinne, you have been listening, and we paired these obviously because what goes better with bleeding and blood glucose than Neuro and PADIS, right? So Corinne got to hear all the analysis, all the discussion. What are your thoughts? What are you thinking?
Jason, I think I'm pretty much with you. I think Crash 2, Nice Sugar, those are the two that are making it to the end. I think ProCoag will go far just because that the cost with PCC, we're always thinking about that. But you had me at what do you always talk about with pharmacy students? And I talk about Crash 2, but I always talk about Nice Sugar. And so I think from generalizability to every single unit, I'm going to go with Nice Sugar for this too.
Now, Corinne, let me ask a question though, because we were talking, Jason was saying he thought Leuven won undeserving. I thought it was underrated. When you talk about Nice Sugar, can you talk about Nice Sugar without mentioning the Leuven trials? Are they tandemed?
You just mentioned that they are debunked by Nice Sugar. So, yeah.
Maybe I just like to hear myself talk more.
Them in there. But I don't think we need to worry about those studies too much anymore.
All right, so you agree. So you have Nice. The bracketologists are agreeing, and I did not agree with them. So that's a bad look for Nick when the experts pick something completely different. Because I have Nice Sugar losing in the round of 32 to said ProCoag study.
This episode of Pharmacy to Dose is proudly sponsored by Chiesi. Providing innovative pharmacologic therapies for over 85 years, Chiesi is committed to supporting the clinical pharmacist community and the patients you serve. To learn more, visit chiesi.pharmacytodose.com.
What an amazing review from bracketologist Jason Hecht for the East region. Jason, hang on, because just like Corinne got to give some thoughts on the bleeding blood glucose, the East region bracket, you're going to get to hang tight and give some thoughts on the North region, aka the Neuro PADIS region. So Corinne, come on back. Let's introduce the bracket for the listeners. And just so for ones keeping track at home, in my votes for which trials to include Neuro, I was the least correct. I was pretty good on the other ones. I only got 7 out of the 17 that were initially included. But we're going to get into it. I got some beef with some of the studies, but we'll get into it. Let's get into the bracket itself. The North region, Neuro PADIS. And we have the third ranked 1 seed, the NINS trial, looking at, of course, TPA in acute ischemic stroke, a wagon, the Neuro PADIS region, facing the play-in game, actually. So the 16 seed is a matchup between the Dawn study and the Select 2 study. Now, our 8-9 matchup is what we call a seizure special here. It's the Rampart trial versus the VA co-op study. So just 2 absolute electric teams. Curious who's going to stop who there. Now, in our 5-12 awesome matchup, we got Prodex, Midex versus Men's 2. So again, lots of awesome sedation battles here. Now, the 4 seed, we're going to get into this 4 seed, maybe a little low-ranked 4 seed, the Rose trial, versus, I feel like this is a bad matchup, by the way, the 13 seed Mind USA study looking at our antipsychotic treatment of delirium. How could we have the Neuropathic region without a matchup of 2 of the most infamous studies on blood pressure control in ICH, Interact 2 versus Attach 2? So the 6 versus 11 with Interact 2 ranked higher. The ESIT trial coming in at number 3, taking on our 14 seed, the Nimodipine studies, coming in as an at-large bid. They won their conference tournament at the very end. Now, closing out our last 2 matchups, our number 7 seed, the Men's trial, taking on our number 10 seed, the SEDCOM trial. So again, another little sedation battle. And then the 2 seed, Awake and Breathe, taking on the 15 seed, the ECAS 3 trial. So, Corinne, we just went over the Neuropathic region. First things first, what are your instant thoughts? What beef do you have with teams or trials that were included or not included?
Yeah, well, I had to go with Jason on the tenecteplase exclusion here. We got, Extend IA, TNK, 1 and 2, Nortest 2, ACT, Trace 2. I mean, any of these could have been contenders. Especially like Extend IA, that kind of put tenecteplase on the map, or the ACT trial, which helped, strengthen the supporters for tenecteplase. So that was definitely one whole area. And then, I saw that Rose made it and Accurasis got left out. And maybe I'm biased because Accurasis came out when I was in residency. So I just personally felt like it had this profound impact on paralytics for ARDS, in particular, obviously, cisatracurium. So I was surprised that those, the one trial and then the full tenecteplase category of trials were left out.
Couldn't believe no tenecteplase trials. Like, I expected it. The ACT study looked like a top 6 seed to me. Are you kidding? We're using tenecteplase in everything. And
topic at every conference.
Literally. So I couldn't believe it. Also, the other thing that stood out to me, man, we got a lot of the old sedation studies. Like, where's the SPICE 3 trial? Right? Where's a more modern day looking? Like, we're looking at trials that weren't even doing awakening and breathing trials. We're including them. So I got beef with that. Right? We could just take off Men's or SEDCOM. Just pick one. Pick one. Let's see. Maybe recency bias. I feel like the bundles are kind of making a comeback. I felt like Interact 3 could have got some play. I don't know. The thrombectomy studies aren't as interesting to me. Like, I know in the neuro world, the Dawn study is really cool. I don't really care because I don't work in neuro IR. I don't care about Select 2 either. Maybe that's a hot take, but that explains why I got 7 out of 17 correct in this bracket.
Yeah, I was going to say Dawn was one of my underrated teams. I could not believe that was a play-in team. I mean, I know it's thrombectomy, but that fundamentally changed the way we treat stroke in around the world, basically. So surprised to see Dawn there.
It's funny you say that. So let's talk about snubs here, because you loved Dawn and Select 2. Those were teams 67 and 68. They were the last 2 in, the lowest voted trials. You want to know the first 2 that got cut? ACT and Accurasis. So the question is, would you trade thrombectomy for the 2 you were talking about? Because you can't advocate to add one without saying which ones you would take out.
You know what's interesting is I would say, I know we're all really excited about tenecteplase, and I'd love to jump on that bandwagon with you, but as far as actual clinical outcomes and not just ease of administration, these thrombectomy trials have it over tenecteplase any day.
Okay, I like that. And that's why you're the bracketologist. That's why you're the expert. I also thought Enchanted 2 MT, right? Blood pressure post-thrombectomy. This study kind of changed the game, stopped a bunch of trials. I don't know. But I think this goes to show, I think that there are, at least in a lot of these brackets, it felt like there were enough studies where it's like, how am I going to choose 17 of them? And Neuro PADIS was definitely one of those, because even though some of those sedation studies we were talking about, they're kind of past, they're still important. We just don't use them now, right? So, okay.
Yeah, I think this region was definitely dominated by some of those smaller studies that had a huge impact, but then there's a lot of them. So to really just pick one versus like a class of studies was tough.
Now let's kind of analyze the region. What's this region look like before we'll get into talking about some of the seeds here? So 7 PADIS studies, 4 sedation, 1 delirium, 1 paralysis, 1 looking at the SATs, SPTs. 4 acute ischemic stroke studies were split right in the middle, 2 thrombolytic, 2 thrombectomy, 3 status epilepticus studies, 2 ICH studies, and an amlodipine in a pear tree. That's correct. 13 articles published in New England Journal of Medicine, JAMA getting 3 with Lancet, and shout out BMJ getting one of the studies. And looking at the time frame, this is definitely the oldest region with the oldest study. And that would also make sense being neuro, right? So pre-2000s, there are 4 studies, with the oldest being 1983 New England Journal. I'm old, and when we're talking about a study that was done before I was born, that's like an old study. Over 40 years, so shout out that. The 2000s, 5 studies. The 2010s, 7, and 2020 to present, we have 2. So pretty evenly spread out, though. Every other region had a year with 3 trials published in it. This year just had multiple years with 2, with the mean being 2009. Okay, so talked about the ranking, or we talked about the teams. Corinne, let's talk about the rankings. When you looked at it, you kind of highlighted, you're like, wait, Dawn is criminally underrated. What other matchups or trials stood out as over or underrated?
Yeah, I mean, I was surprised to see Prodex Midex at number 5. As pharmacist, a drug company sponsored trial wouldn't be up that high in my book. And then just like we talked about, right, we have the men's study that had a similar playbook, and that was published many years earlier. And I think that some of these studies just had a lot of momentum early on, but I really don't see them advancing to the final round. And then Prodex Midex, they got lucky. I would have liked to see them actually go up against men's, so we could really have a good answer, a more fair battle between the benzo harm Precedex benefit. But I guess, that's the way the seeding works out.
I think they're both overrated. Prodex Midex being a 5 seed blows my mind. Now the 4 in this region, the 4 trials with unanimous voting, NINS, Awake and Breathe, ESIT, and Rose. So top 4 trials with unanimous votes to include. To me, I actually think men's 2 is underrated, underseeded. I think that's a dark horse candidate in my opinion. Man, nimodipine got such a bad draw. That feels like it would be a Cinderella, but you're going against a wagon. Like, you're going against, like, ESIT has the player of the year. They have the Zach Edey of the trials. So just a really, really tough matchup. But I do got to shout out nimodipine. I also think Interact 2 is overrated. A 6 seed? That felt high to me.
I was okay with it. I mean, I was surprised Interact 2 was so much higher than ATAC 2, but I started thinking about, what came first and the impact on practice. So we were all waiting for ATAC 2, but while we were waiting, we had to do something. And I could definitely tell you we started implementing the results of Interact 2 right away.
I'm going to save some of my thoughts when we get into the actual matchup itself. So, Corinne, I know you have big thoughts on the play-in game for the 16 seeds of Dawn versus Select 2. Please let the listeners know, because my sheet says yawn. That's my thoughts on it. So who do you have? What are your thoughts?
Wow. Well, I put Dawn in for this one. I think Select 2 was a great study too, and definitely adding to the body of data that not only now, Dawn told us we could push thrombectomy from 6 hours to 24 hours. And the reason it's so fundamental is because most stroke patients do not present to the hospital within 4.5 to 6 hours. And so we really have not had any intervention for those patients. So when Diffuse 3 and Dawn came out, that's why it was so fundamental. And now we could even transfer patients to our hospitals for them to receive this intervention. Select 2 is pretty cool because, we thought that we could only provide a benefit for these patients that had a small core volume and a lot of penumbra to save. And this is really telling us that we're just expanding the pool of patients that could benefit from this intervention. But I think that that incremental change after we've, very widely accepted mechanical thrombectomy and that expanded time window to 24 hours, even though SELECT-2 is a great study as well, I think Dawn had more of an impact with regard to the guidelines and clinical practice as well.
Now, the other side, SELECT-2 got stopped early because it was so effective, right? If we're just playing, if we're playing both sides of it, but I agree. I think Dawn's just a more fun trial name to say, right? If we're a better uniform, all the things. All right, moving on from the play-in games to the first round, we got 8 games, 16 trials. What are a few that instantly got your attention that we can dive into a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I know I'm neuro biased, but I think the exciting matchups will be Rampart versus the VA cooperative trial. The VA cooperative trial is an older, more tested trial, but it definitely has the experience to give the sort of upcomer Rampart a run for its money. But having said that, I think I'm going with Rampart on this one. The VA cooperative trial was very interesting and data that we needed to really assess what is our first line treatment for status epilepticus. But the comparators were so weird, phenobarbital, benzo plus phenytoin, that and the study design could be a little confusing to someone who, this isn't their bread and butter. Versus Rampart, this is very straightforward. It's answering a very basic question that's applicable almost everywhere, especially within neuro, ICU, and ER. Do I give an IV therapy and place a line, or am I giving IM therapy right away? And I think this study really provided a clear role for giving IM midazolam over IV lorazepam in certain settings. So I picked Rampart to go through on this round, but I thought it was an interesting matchup for the neuro nerds.
It's going to be so close, right? The VA co-op being an inpatient study, they get their points in the paint. They live in the paint inside, and Rampart out of hospital, right? Looking into the ED. So they live and die by the 3. I think it's going to be really close. The determining factor was inpatient treatment. I chose the VA co-op study, but I think it's going to be close. I think either one could win, and I wouldn't be surprised either way. All right. As you go through, what else kind of stood out to you?
Well, I have my upset right away here. I'm sure this may not be popular, but I had Rose against Mind USA. So number 4 and number 13. I gotta tell you, Rose's study was great, and it's what we were waiting for. But were we surprised? Were we shocked by the results? I think it was results that validated things we knew. We were oversedating patients with ARDS. We saw this in COVID, and we've seen this historically in practice. And it was great to have a study come out and really, validate some of the things we knew. But first of all, we're still using a lot of paralytics in patients with ARDS, including continuous infusion paralytics, for much longer than 48 hours. And Mind USA is our only study that has atypical and typical antipsychotics that is something that we're doing a lot in practice too. So I had this as my upset. Happy to debate you further on it.
Yeah, I got questions here. You can't say Accurasis is your one trial left out, and you have Rose losing in the first round. So to me, look, I think the Rose trial is actually one of our more practice-changing articles, because I agree in more contemporary academic settings, we weren't using fixed dose 37.5 milligrams per hour. I can tell you in the smaller settings where I came from, we were very much using that. And I think that was more practice changing. Because tell me, how did your practice change from the Mind USA trial? What's one thing that changed from it?
I mean, I think Mind USA is going to help tell us that, one, we don't have to assess for delirium, maybe as much as we thought that we had to. We don't need to treat hypoactive delirium, and that we can ignore the results as much as we want because we can keep treating hyperactive delirium as much as we want. And it compared 2 different antipsychotics, typical and atypical, so just giving us data for patients in the ICU. But I agree that clinically the impact's not going to be so strong, but as far as people talking about it and having some representation from our adjunctive agents, which has become a hot topic, I think it can move forward potentially against Rose. And I agree, Rose is a good study, but based on when it was published, I don't think at that time that people were shocked that we could use less paralytics. I think it was a great study, but if I'm forced to do an upset, that was the one I picked for my upset.
And, anytime you have a player on your team like Joanna Stallings, literally anything can happen. When she's part of your starting five, you're right. Upsets can happen. Feels like a low 13 seed. That's what I was saying. Feels like a bad matchup because the Mind USA, it's also got a great name. Feels patriotic. It's got USA at the end of it. It's got a pharmacist that we all know and love in the author list. So,
I'm Team Joanna any day.
Well, and of course, when I asked you what you learned, of course, you schooled and had like 8 things that you learned from that trial. So, okay, we'll agree to disagree. Great upset pick. As you go through. Now do you have any more upsets? Cause I'll tell you, I got a couple more in this bracket, in this region.
For upsets, I gotta tell you, I pretty much stuck with the seeding. The only other one that could have almost been a Cinderella story to me was Dawn, but you can't put Dawn against NINS, unfortunately, especially as pharmacists. TPA for stroke is, just something that's been ingrained into us as members of the stroke team. So I don't have any more upsets here.
I got men's too, the 12 seed upsetting Prodex Midex as the 5 seed.
I have men's too.
You know what? It probably feels like the seeds were switched. You're like, how's men's 2 the 5 and Prodex Midex as the 12? Yeah.
You're right. My brain just inverted that Prodex Midex didn't deserve it. So I just took their seeding away. But you know what? You're absolutely right. Men's 2, I have going over Prodex Midex. Some of these sedation trials, I think, were a little tossed up. For me, men's 2 was a little bit more interesting because it helped, Precedex was kind of on a roll. And I think looking at Precedex versus propofol and showing that actually, probably you can get away with using propofol still going to be an ICU drug for many years to come. I thought that gave it a good spot for us here.
Yeah, I'm pro dexmedetomidine, but this study showed, hey, if we have them nicely sedated and their hemodynamics are fine on propofol, we don't need to make this crazy switch to that, right? So I agree. I had a couple other upsets. Maybe they're not going to be upsets. I'll be curious your thoughts because I have Interact 2 going down. When we're looking at blood pressure in ICH, this feels like to me the matchup of the first round. Interact 2 2015, ATACH 2 2016. Who do you have winning this?
You're totally right, Nick. I'm sorry. I think I reseeded all of these teams to just align with my preferences. 100%. I have ATAC too. Like I said, Interact 2 came out, and that was really important at the time because even though it may seem obvious now, we really didn't know if lowering your blood pressure, these are patients who are coming, really hypertensive, and it seems like it might make sense to lower their blood pressure so they won't have hematoma expansion, patients with intracerebral hemorrhage. But we didn't know if it was safe to do that or if we're going to cause more harm. And so that study did definitely help us realize that probably that's something good to do. Now, it was a little bit complicated because they're using Urapidil and all these other drugs we didn't really have. And a lot of these patients weren't even that hypertensive. So it was hard to extrapolate. And then it took them 6 hours to actually get the blood pressure down. So it was a great study, but the seeding here, I agree, doesn't make sense, which is probably why I went ahead and just reseeded these teams in my mind.
Yeah, I mean, the Interact 2 using all the different combinations, whereas ATAC 2 using IV nicardipine pretty much primarily, and the blood pressure in the ATAC 2 being typically in the mean, I think it was 200s, right, or high 190s versus the others being closer to 150s, 160s. So kind of more of those, because when someone's hypertensive in ICH, you're getting more of the ATAC 2 trial, not the Interact 2. And I think anytime you have a trilogy, we have Interact 2, and Interact 3. People instantly are like, it's got to be better, right? So I'm guessing that's why the committee put it as the 6th seed. Completely agree. Now, the other upsets left and right in this first round for me is men's versus Sedcom. And instantly I just said, hey, I think I'm more likely to use midazolam versus lorazepam, and that's going to be my choice. And I'm going to move on with Sedcom. Sedcom 68 centers, right? So they got their palms all across. Men's only had 2, but it was US. But they're both pre-SAT SBT. So it's kind of like, that feels like a different era, which is my argument for newer studies, right? Spice, all those things. But I got Sedcom in the upset.
This one was a coin toss for me. I think I could go either way. Men's came out first, and I think by the time Sedcom was coming out, we had some data telling us benzos were bad. So different drugs, I guess you could pick your favorite, but I think the negative effect of benzos probably could apply across the class.
And then I think the last two matchups we can kind of easily pass. Awake and Breathe versus ECAS 3. Unfortunately, that's going to be a 40-point blowout that after 5 minutes we're going to turn off. No chance, right? Unfortunately. Sorry, ECAS. That's that extended window thrombolytic treatment versus our SAT SBT. So I think it's no contest, right?
Yeah, tough draw for ECAS 3 because definitely us pharmacists on the stroke team that always gave us those 4 additional exclusion criteria that we had to remember that now don't even apply anymore anyway. And it didn't change care, but not as much as Awake and Breathe. Absolutely.
And then, man, 3 versus 14, that's going to be a really fun matchup. But, man, nimodipine drawing ESET is just so unfair. Nimodipine, they had the 60-year senior trying to come back, trying to make noise, oldest guy in the tournament to do it. And they're just going up against a blue blood juggernaut. Just it feels like no chance. It's kind of like the Monstars in Space Jam, it feels like.
Such a bummer for nimodipine because, remember this trial, the oldest one in our region from the early 80s, really did set nimodipine as one of the only level 1 recommendations for patients with aneurysmal subarachnoid hemorrhage. Cool drug, different formulations, but hard to go up against ESET.
All right, let's move into our second round, the round of 32. So we have 4 matchups, 8 teams. So, Corinne, when you look at the matchups, what instantly stands out to you in this round of 32?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a very scary matchup between ATAC2 and ESET. These are 2 classic neuro debates, blood pressure management and intracerebral hemorrhage and first-line anti-seizure medication and status epilepticus. And what's interesting is neither study leaves us feeling fully satisfied, but I think ESET will take it because while I like ATAC2, I think ESET's too tough to take down in this round.
Yeah, ESET's the crowd favorite. It's a great story. They got the hometown crowd behind them. It's gonna be a home court advantage. We still have questions, right, about blood pressure. I said we're still studying. Interact 3 just came out. I think ESET answered more questions than created new ones compared to that. So close game. I agree. Close spread, but I think ESET pulls it out in the end. Any other close ones or anything like that?
I think NINS and Rampart could be close because, I think Rampart's just newer. So we have some recency complex and we have some drugs that are more applicable to different people and maybe some more exciting information with bringing EMS in and pre-hospital stroke. But I still have NINS taking it for this one, but definitely Rampart giving it a run for its money.
I think NINS is the first 1 seed to lose in this bracket. I think compared to the other regions, I think it's even though it's the 3rd ranked, I think it's got the shakiest resume. It won its conference tournament. It won some important games. When you look at it, I'm telling you, I think the seizure matchup, regardless of who wins, I think is going to upset them. I really do.
Yeah, I think, a lot of my EM friends were really anti-TPA or not the biggest TPA alteplase supporters for a long time. But what's so interesting is when tenecteplase came into play, arguably a drug that hasn't really had the strongest data really showing it's so much consistently better than alteplase in every trial that has been published. But the EM folks jumped all over that. So for that reason, I'm like, maybe they're getting back on board with fibrinolytics. And so I'm hoping that will strengthen the NINS game somehow, riding the tailcoat of tenecteplase.
Yeah, I mean, NINS is a 30-year-old study with a championship pedigree. It's been there. It's done it. It's been battle-tested. So it's going to be a close matchup. I agree. I could truly see it coming down to the last possession. You had 2 upsets going into this round of 32. So men's 2 versus Mind USA. Who do you have coming out in this PADIS battle?
I kept Mind USA going. I got to tell you, I think what happened is all these sedation trials, and we were really excited about Precedex a while back and figuring out how to restrict it. And I think now people are liking Precedex, but the excitement and the momentum has gone away. And I think adjunctive treatment, especially since COVID and things like that, has made its way back up. Not to say that Mind USA is the study that we're leaning on, but I'm hoping that maybe people will have some recency complex here and have just maybe forgotten about some of these sedation trials that all get muddled together.
Well, like you said, thinking about which study you're more likely to talk to a learner who's with you for a few weeks, probably more Mind USA than going in depth on like the MENS 2 or some of those early kind of sedation trials. So I believe that. Oh. Or MENS 2s in 2021. Either way, I just pulled that up. So, but
rewind. Men's 2, just like we were saying, they all get muddled in your brain.
Everything we were talking about is just MENS 2. Just that's what that was the matchup. That's what we're talking about. It was modern day. I
gotta tell you, I'm like Jason with this. Some of these neuro studies are pretty exciting. The sedation studies, when I was a resident, they were exciting. And as more and more of these started coming out, you kind of read through the abstract, look at it, check, we're doing this, and move on. So yes, MENS 2, you're right, does still have that recency complex.
But I think we can breeze past the other study, which is the first MENS trial versus Awake and Breathe, right? I mean, MENS was pre-Awake and Breathe. Awake and Breathe has its own freaking letter in the Liberation bundle. Shout out B. So it feels like, right, this is another just 40-point blowout for the Awake and Breathe team as they go to the next weekend.
I'm with you there 100%.
Okay. So recapping in our Sweet 16. So Corinne, you have the NINS versus Mind USA, and then ESIT versus Awake and Breathe. Whereas mine, I have the VA co-op study. That's right. I had that upside in the NINS trial versus the ROSE trial, and then the ESIT trial versus the Awake and Breathe. So same matchup on the bottom, completely different teams in the top matchup of the Sweet 16. All right. So Corinne, when you look at these two matchups in your bracket, what's your favorite? What's the one you want to talk about the most between those two?
I mean, definitely ESIT versus Wake Up and Breathe. This is now starting to become, all right, neuro versus sedation. I got to say, ESIT, as the neuro person, was a trial we had been waiting for. It was finally going to answer the question, all right, which anti-seizure medication is best? Is Keppra a drug that we can use for patients who really have refractory status epilepticus or really just benzo-refractory status epilepticus? Unfortunately, though, it didn't really have a clear-cut winner that we wanted. And then, even worse than that, it kind of told us that whatever drug you pick, fosphenytoin, levetiracetam, valproic acid, none of those are going to be that good. They're all going to have a seizure cessation rate of less than 50%. So that was kind of a bummer. Definitely still an impactful trial. I mean, it probably changed levetiracetam bolus dosing forevermore. But it is really hard to argue against just the widespread impact of the Wake Up and Breathe trial. And for that, I say, not just in one patient population, but for every ICU and really almost every patient population. So I think this round is going to end it for ESIT, and Awake and Breathe is going to be too much for them to handle.
Okay. So I need this to go in the record. It is March 2024. And a neuropharmacist just picked a non-neuro study. What is happening? I can't believe this. This is an absolute bloodbath matchup. Feels like Florida, Kentucky. If we're going old school, Florida, Ohio State, those championship matchups. To me, I chose ESIT because we're comparing pharmacologic intervention versus non-pharm. And even though there was no winner, our dosing for Keppra changed forever. No one was routinely giving 4.5 grams like we now do for those status patients. It just wasn't.
And how annoying is that, though?
Oh, 5 ml vials. Are we kidding? Yeah. Don't even get me. You come in like you got them all in your in like your shirt when you're going into the room because you can't hold them all in your hand.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could go with you there, and if it was against any other trial. But even though Wake Up and Breathe, wasn't one specific drug, a lot of what we do as pharmacists, we pride ourselves. If you're an ICU pharmacist, you have to be able to manage sedation and to talk about sedation and speak to your role even in reducing sedation. So that's why ESIT had to go in this round.
Okay, so we have another neuro versus PADIS matchup, which is the NINS versus the Mind USA trial. All right, so what are we, team neuro or team PADIS in this Sweet 16 matchup?
I am happy to finally say goodbye to Mind USA here. I think it had a good run. I mean, I don't think we expected it to go this far, but I think it had, it had a really good bracket setup and was able to beat out some of those sedation trials, but NINS is definitely going to take it here. I mean, this is a study that we talk about, a study that has been cited in multiple clinical guidelines and will continue to be cited in clinical guidelines and taught as long as we're teaching about acute ischemic stroke. It's the first thing we talk about.
Yeah, if we're picking the winner based on the name or the jersey, the way the jersey font, right? Mind USA wins by a landslide. But for longevity, influence, feels like NINS ends the Cinderella story for sure. All right. So again, we got both bracketologists 1v2 in both of these. So our Elite Eight, the 1 seed NINS looking at alteplase and acute ischemic stroke versus the 2 seed Awake and Breathe. So NINS 1995, Awake and Breathe 2008, looking at SAT, SBT in mechanically ventilated patients. Talk us through who's your Final Four team in the North region, the Neuro PADIS region.
Nick, I was tempted to go with NINS on this, but I had to go for Awake and Breathe. So I had to break with my neuro studies. I think NINS is a great study and told us a lot. But like I said, I think Awake and Breathe is just having an impact and continues to have an impact. And where I mentioned NINS is going to be part of guidelines, it's a historical part of guidelines and is slowly potentially going to be replaced and even recommended with other drugs recommended over it. Whereas Awake and Breathe is a core staple of what we do and really set the stage for multiple other studies to sort of lead the way in this area. So that's my pick for this region.
I mean, it honestly feels like, you're a Florida fan. It feels like Awake and Breathe just won an Elite Eight game in Lexington, Kentucky with the whole crowd against them, because how a non-neuro study won with a neuropharmacy bracketologist. So that's just absolutely incredible news for the PADIS. I don't know. You're going to have to let us know if the neuro world invites you back, Corinne, for not picking NINS on the national stage.
Yeah, we'll have to find out. I guess it'll be a win-win, because if my bracket's upset for a neuro study, I don't know how sad I'm going to be.
Oh, look at you doing the emotional hedge. Love that. All right. Jason, join us back. You were listening to our neuro PADIS analyzation and our region discussion. What are your thoughts?
My first thought is I will never forgive the committee for putting nimodipine as a 14 seed and having to go against ESID in the first round. I don't think there's a team in the tournament I'm rooting harder for than nimodipine. They have 5 6th-year seniors playing on their COVID year, hustling as hard as they possibly can around the court. I'm rooting for nimodipine hard, and I really hope they pull a big upset here. And they're the most likable team in the tournament to me.
Hey, your out of conference schedule matters. They didn't have enough quad 1 and quad 2 wins, right? They got the pedigree, but they had to do it. Hey, they got in. I know. Bloodbath matchup. I agree. Nimodipine had Cinderella potential for sure. Just ran into a buzzsaw. So any issues with the way the region went? Any thoughts on big things? You're like, wait, what?
I know it was a smaller part of the discussion, but I think you guys had a TAC2 and Interact2 all wrong. I think Interact is the better trial there, deserves the better seeding, and ultimately is going to win that one. Blood pressure just dropped too low in a TAC2. Mean was less than 120 in the intensive treatment group, and I just don't think we can use those results for anything because they dropped the mean blood pressure in the study group a little bit too far and just doesn't make it applicable and translatable to practice. I think Interact2 is taking that one purely because of name recognition and ultimately stay a little more true to the objective of looking at a systolic blood pressure goal of 140. Outside of that, I think Corinne pretty much had the bracket nailed. I think Awake and Breathe is the clear juggernaut in this north part of the bracket and is easily going to advance to not only the Final Four, but in my mind, that's the ultimate national champion. They're winning the whole thing. There's no study on this list that has made more of an impact and is used every day. You have Wes Ely on the paper, maybe the godfather of modern critical care. I think that study carries far, far too much weight and is ultimately going to be our national champion, not only come out of the North bracket. I did find it funny that Corinne picked a non-neuro study and me as a trauma pharmacist picked a glucose study to advance out of the bracket.
Unbelievable.
One hurt a little bit. But yeah, I think Awake and Breathe is ultimately the national champion and the clear winner here. And Corinne had it spot on.
For the listeners,
for victory.
Jason had a chance to pick 16 different studies, and he picked one of 3 studies that I actually agreed with Corinne on. So, all right, shots fired. Yeah, these are incredible matchups. The North region and the East region, right? So we're looking at that East, the right side of the bracket. So just to conclude, right? Corinne has Awake and Breathe. I have the ESA trial going on, for the record. I think it's a bloodbath. I think whoever wins that goes on. I think that's the region there. And then looking at that East region, right? Jason, our bracketologist for the bleeding and blood glucose bracket, he had Nice Sugar and I had Trick. So can't thank our bracketologists enough for coming in and helping this out. For the listeners to know, I hope you all know how I sent everyone involved, multiple emails, messages. They're probably so annoyed with all the communications I'm giving them, but this was awesome and they absolutely crushed it. So on this side of the region, Corinne and Jason, can't thank you both enough. We appreciate you coming on, bringing on your analysis and expertise to help the listeners pick the best bracket for the 2024 Critical Care Trials March Madness.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. This was a lot of fun. Looking forward to see how the results play out, and maybe we get to hear from us again once we get some Final Four results.
Another huge thanks to our bracketologist, Jason Hecht, for the bleeding blood glucose region, and Corinne Berger for the Neuro PADIS region. What an awesome job. But remember, this is only half the bracket. So we previewed 2 regions. Be sure to listen to the other episode previewing the sepsis, fluids, and cardiac pulmonary region, right? Voting at PharmacyToDose on Twitter or Instagram. If you want to find a bracket on those same social medias or PharmacyToDose.com, definitely let me know what you think. This has been a whole lot of fun to do and make. So I hope you all have as much fun as I've been having with it, but definitely let me know your feedback. But until next time, I'm Nick Peters, and this is Pharmacy to Dose, the Critical Care Podcast. The Critical Care PRN optimizes drug therapy outcomes by promoting excellence and innovation in clinical pharmacy practice, research, and education. For more information, go to critprn.accp.com. Again, that is critprn.accp.com. The podcast provides general information only and does not offer individualized medical or professional healthcare services, including pharmaceutical advice. The contents and materials in the podcast are not intended to be a substitute for inpatient pharmaceutical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Use of the contents and materials on the podcast does not constitute a pharmacist-patient relationship. As a result, the information in and materials linked to this podcast are applied at the user or patient's own risk. Users and patients should consult their physician or personal healthcare professional. Users and patients should not ignore or delay seeking care because of something they heard on this podcast. In case of an emergency, the user or patient should contact their physician, call 911, or go to the nearest medical emergency facility. The views and statements expressed on this podcast are those of the host and guests and should not be interpreted to reflect the official position or policy of ACCP or the Critical Care PRN. ACCP and the Critical Care PRN disclaim any and all liability or responsibility for any direct, indirect, incidental, special, consequential, or any other damages, including without limitation, loss of profits arising out of any use of, reference to, reliance on, or inability to use the podcast, its contents, and materials.